So I think the first correction is that, if I may call it a correction, is that IT projects fail generally across all the ecosystems, whether it's public or private sector. It's just that if an IT project fails in the private sector, you never get to know about it. But if it fails in the public sector, you will definitely get to know about it. And as we saw, for instance, with the SIM card registration, right? The SIM card registration exercises, it failed in the private sector. It was done as a private sector twice, and it failed. So how come? So but on the government side, whatever government does something and it doesn't work, we're all up in arms, and that makes sense. It's taxpayers' money. But I just want to correct the impression that technology projects specifically in public sector do not work, or that they fail. I mean, given the resources available to the private sector, I think our level of tolerance for failure in the private sector should be much, much lower than it is, because the private sector has the resources. They don't face the constraints that the public sector has. They don't deal to the level. So for instance, if I wanted to do ERP in my company, I'll be doing ERP in my company for 300 people, 5,000 people. The largest enterprise in Nigeria probably has 10,000 employees, maybe 15,000 employees. If government does ERP, it's talking about ERP over 680 NDAs. So the complexity in government is much, much greater. The second thing is that government is also constrained by the fact that it has to be transparent. It has to be, it has other kind of like controls that have to be put in place that you don't find in the private sector. So let's assume, for instance, that we wanted to implement a technology project. Can we implement that technology project in government, in your local government alone? Right from inception, we have to ask ourselves, well, where is it going to be? If I do it in your local government, you have to do it in this local government, you must get geographic spread, correct? Yes. So that immediately creates some complications, and those complications would have to do with like the resources. Do we have the resources in all these locations to drive this? Can we do this evenly? Let's look at an example. Let's say government wants to run fiber. If you want to run fiber in as a technology project in the government, you can't run it in the place where the need is the most. You have to run it everywhere. So you can't take fiber only. I mean, you remember when the GSM companies were coming in, they were told that they were mandated that they must cover everywhere, and it was written into their agreements. But of course, they went to the places where they could make the most money. And as we speak today, the networks are weakest in the areas where they make the least amount of money. It's the logic of the market. Government cannot afford that. They must do what they have to do. So when I'm trying to identify the things that you see as constraints. Of course, the popular conventional wisdom is always focused on things like the politics of things and the interference that comes from that, and sometimes people talk a lot about the corruption and all that sort of stuff. But from a strictly project management perspective, public sector projects are so much more complex than a private sector project. They're also not as well resourced. If I were working for gain in a commercial environment and I had a project, I could simply take the cost of the best resource, impute it into my project, and pass the cost on to the consumer and say to the consumer, here's what it's going to cost you to get this done. Here's the cost that you're going to get for getting this service, and I take my entire cost and build that into my pricing, right? Yeah. But government can't do that. And an example would be metering. So we all need meters, but if we ask the consumer to pay the true cost of the meter, there'll be a revolt in the country. So you have to figure out how you're going to make that happen. If government decides it wants to do digitalization now of broadcast services, for instance, they're going to face the challenge that, I used to get NTA free. Now you're saying you have to go and buy a box to get this NTA. Is it not paid for by taxpayers' money? Why should you block it? Why can't I have? So everything in government has a certain twist that we have to recognize. And I've worked in government, I've done IT projects in government for the past 20-25 years. I know that there are challenges, the ones that we like to focus on, but the ones we don't like to talk about are the ones that I'm trying to bring out now, that these are very real things that we must take into consideration. Having said that, I think that if I had to point to one single element that was the biggest point of contention or possibly failure for government technology projects is the visioning. Understanding the real role of technology in delivering a particular service requires knowledge of technology, but it also requires strength in terms of your strategic thinking. Wow. When we say monoproduct, we have to put that again in context. Okay. Is it monoproduct in terms of export?
Okay, in terms of what we are producing.
Okay, so producing for who? Here's the first question. I mean, you have economic choices to make. Are you producing for yourself or you're producing for others? If you look at most of the things that we consume in this country, I mean domestic demand, the question you should ask is how much of what we consume domestically is produced domestically. Usually until you satisfy your demand to a reasonable, if not total extent in any sector, you will not have developed the competencies to export what you have. You understand? In a structured country, well played, Nigeria would have satisfied itself in terms of production of oil and the derivatives of oil before it started exporting. Yeah. You asked about this agriculture versus technology in terms of emphasis for growth in the context of an economy that is monocultural more or less. So, and I think my thinking, which is not as well informed in terms of agriculture as it is in terms of technology, is that it's not an either or, it's an and. So you have to do certain things on both sides, and you have to understand the role of each side. Agriculture would not drive this economy. Agriculture would kind of like impact our costs, for instance, in terms of let's say Nigeria, for instance, Nigeria imports 95% of the milk, and the milk-related products in Nigeria are based on imports. Okay, 90% of the tomatoes at some point were based on imports. All the tomato paste was imported into the country. Rice, even though we had rice, was like Nigeria is amongst the top 10 producers of rice in the world, but we were importing rice. So if you take care of those type of things, two things happen. First of all, the amount of money that you actually spend, dollars, because everything that you import is paid for with dollars. The amount of money that you actually spend, dollars that you actually spend bringing in products shrinks, right? So that money then is available for other sectors of the economy. The second thing that happens is that if you're producing locally, you drive up the level of employment. And there's general GDP growth in that sector, so you have more people who are employed. But the big question that pivots around for me on the agricultural story is this. If you see agriculture as a way of employing people, it flies in the face of what is happening everywhere else in the world, where there's greater efficiency of labor in agriculture. So a country like the US, only 3% of its population produces all its food. So mechanized agriculture and today technology-enabled agriculture through things like aquaponics, hydroponics, and those type of things are driving, and of course all the issues around genetically modified seeds and those type of things is driving huge efficiencies in terms of how you produce these goods, and labor is the lowest contributor factor of production in that space in other countries. We want to do the reverse. So we're claiming that we'll employ a lot of people. We're going to employ them in sedentary farming, basically, or the next step above sedentary farming, not large-scale mechanized farming. And that is good in the short term, in a lot of ways, but it's not sustainable in the long term, because as more and more of those technology-enabled type of agricultural companies or organizations are coming into your environment, you will lose that labor. You understand? And that labor will then have to be shifted into another sector. So in the medium to long term, you can't say that you're going to going to take a country like Nigeria, and a vision for a country like Nigeria is to have 10 million youths farming. It's not the case anywhere in the world. And we are competing on a global stage, and that's my opinion. I mean, people may differ. I contrast that with technology, which is unique in the sense that technology is not just an enabler. It's an accelerator and it's a multiplier. Everywhere you inject technology successfully, you enable massive efficiencies in the way that you're doing things before. You cause an acceleration of transactions, economic transactions and engagements to happen. And then you see that there's a multiplier that is built on top of that. So technology came into telephony. And look at where we are 10, 15 years later. And you can imagine that we spent 3.5 decades in darkness. Once it hits a system, and it's one of the only drivers that can actually has those properties. Once you introduce technology into an environment, it causes a disruptive change. And the disruption happens in the terms of how the acceleration that it brings to that industry. It just simply transforms that industry and it starts churning over much, much faster. And because it's churning over much, much faster, it has a network effect. So it creates a multiplier in the system. So for every unit investment, every unit growth, every basis point growth in technology, in an economy, it creates a multiplier of 20, 30, 40, in some cases even 50x. There is nothing else that comes close to doing that. Nothing. You look at banking and finance. You bring in technology, you put in ATMs. What happens? You bring in mobile apps, and suddenly your phone is a bank. So branch creation that used to be 250 million naira to establish a branch, right? The cost is zero. Because what you would normally go to and do in a branch, you're doing off of your phone.